So my name is Tara Van Ho. I'm a senior lecturer here at the University of Essex, and it is my great pleasure to welcome my two friends, Jenna Martin and Erica George. Professor Erica George is a Samuel D. Thurman Professor of Law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. Just learned that she is the first woman to hold that particular named professorship, which is amazing. She's also the director of the Tanner Humanities Center at the University of Utah's College of Humanities. She serves on the Board of Trustees of Earth Justice and is a member of the Fair Labor Association Board. She has a new book out. Unfortunately, my version is at my house and I was not awake enough this morning to bring it with me, but her new book is called Incorporating Rights, Strategies to Advance Corporate Accountability, and it explores the responsibility of corporations to respect international human rights in various efforts to hold business enterprises accountable for alleged abuses. Professor Jenna Martin is a professor of law at the West Virginia University, where she has taught courses on business law and ethics, negotiations, and corporate governance and accountability. Her research is in the field of business and human rights, where she has written extensively on many issues, including incorporating the voices of communities into assessments of human rights impacts, examining corporate governance for human rights assessments, and the intersections of securities regulation and human rights. She is the author of several articles on these subjects and several books that she has edited or co-edited. And that includes one from us called Dying to Be Heard, Businesses' Impact on Communities.
It's close enough.
Something like that. And that's with Anthem Press. She also is the editor of the Business and Human Rights Landscape, Moving Forward, Looking Back with CUP, which is one of the, I would say, one of the standards within the field. Her research draws extensively on her practical experience, including her work as senior counsel at the United States Security and Exchange Commission's Division of Enforcement, and as a member of the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights Global Advisory Team. So Jenna and Erica, obviously being based in the US, well, I guess not obviously being based in the US, but from their accents and everything else, they are Americans, as am I. And so we will be talking about racism and business and human rights today. I do want to acknowledge at the beginning that there is a context there and that we are coming at this from a shared communal experience of what racism means in the US. And I think at the end of our talk or at the end of our conversation, we'll talk about future plans for the field of business and human rights with an anti-racism agenda. And within that, we'll talk about what it would mean to bring other voices into this conversation. I do want to note that within the University of Essex, our HRC blog has today published an article about, and I just put it in the chat. We have published a blog post from Dr. Abba Lechvel, and that's examining an indictment of Lundan officials for war crimes in Sudan. And so you can read Abba's excellent blog post, which will help you understand that context and the specifics there. I'm deeply proud of what we have in terms of a business and human rights community. So I do see Dr. Joe Hoekstra is in the audience as well. And so I am very grateful that we have a nice collaborative environment here. The conversation that we're going to be talking about today is on racism and business and human rights. It builds on an article that the three of us co-authored together that appeared in the Washington University International Law Review, Journal of International Law. It's a really bad job of writing things down today. I'm sorry. But it appeared last April. I will put a link in the chat for that as well, where we set out a bit of an agenda on business and human rights and thinking around racism within the field of business and human rights. The issue hadn't been tackled before our article. There's still not, in my opinion, enough writing or thinking on this issue, but we are very excited that next week, the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights is hosting a panel as part of its 10th annual UN Forum on Business and Human Rights that will tackle the issue of racism within the field, and Professor Martin will be a part of that panel.
Representing this group, let me be very clear, I am not doing this on my own. I'm standing on the shoulders of greats. By the way, and especially because we're at Essex, I think it's probably worth noting, and Tara, you didn't know I was going to do this, so I'm totally going to do this. The genesis for this article was actually Professor Van Ho specifically. She was the one that sort of reached out to both Erica and I after having been asked by the journal to write a piece on racism within the context of business and human rights. And Tara, I thought was very generous of her, said, well, I might not be the best person to write this all by myself. So let me bring in other people who I trust, who we can talk, like have a dialogue. So I really want to commend her for doing that. I thought it was very gracious and humbling. And I think it produced, and I don't say this often actually about articles I work on, but I think it produced a really insightful article. And that was, Tara took the lion's share of that. So I wanted to acknowledge her.
I appreciate that.
I would echo that. No, I would echo that. And not only the production, well, the piece itself and the process, I think, was significant and unique. And again, full credit to Tara for doing that and for reaching out. This is more than just the regular law review article. It was an exchange. And I think in the process of doing it, we learned a lot from one another. While we're in the US context, we experience it very differently. I think all three of us. So Tara, thank you for bringing us together.
Well, thank you guys for participating with this. They will tell you that I was gracious. I will tell you that I just know the limits of privilege here, right? Like out of the three of us, I mean, let's start with a very honest reflection here, which is out of the three of us, I'm the most junior academically. I think that I have done the least out of the three of us to set an agenda for business and human rights, but I am also the one who is most likely to receive praise for doing any of that work. And out of the three of us, I'm probably the only one who receives extensive praise for working on racism within the field of business and human rights. So there is a disparity of privilege within the three of us. And I think acknowledging that is like a precondition before you can even consider working on these issues, right? Like acknowledging where your privilege is. If you can't do that at the start of the project, you should just recuse yourself from the project completely.
Yeah, but Tara, you know that doesn't happen. Like you are actually fairly unusual in that you acknowledge the precondition before you engage in the work.
Okay, I will. Yes, I will accept that. Actually, you're right that that's not the standard practice. My hope is that this can also be the start of that being the standard practice, right? Like if you are offered as a white woman, as a white American woman, to write the first article in the field on racism, let's just start by acknowledging you're not the person who should be doing that. At least you should not be the person doing that on your own. And so for me, it was a precondition to saying yes to that was actually one or both of you co-authoring this. And then let's be honest about the other genesis of this, which is that none of us had time, right? Like we're all extraordinarily busy. And so we talked about the practical realities of that and pulling this together as a conversation.
I did come up with the Zoom idea. That was mine. I was really excited about that.
Yeah, no. So when I said at the beginning that we're actually just continuing what we started with before we started recording this, which is an ongoing conversation amongst friends. That's how we set out the article initially as well, was a conversation on Zoom. We used the Zoom transcript to sort of set the foundation and then really looked into expanding on that a little bit. And it was a real, I mean, everybody who's watching this has already now seen what the dynamic is between the three of us. It is a great deal of love. It is a great deal of trust. It is a continuation of a conversation that we've been having for a couple of years. And my hope is that it's a continuation or the start of a conversation that the broader community will be having. Because we've mostly been having this in hotel rooms and side streets and over fondue and various places in Geneva once a year at the UN Forum. But I think our communal hope and is that this is the start of a more sustained engagement. And thankfully, the working group seems to agree with that. And I really want to single out there Fernanda Hoffenheim, who is our newest member of the UN Working Group and represents Latin America for her vision in bringing this to the forefront of the forum. So thank you, Fernanda. So let's transition to the substance of our article. We started off with a question, and I've said this before when we've had these talks, that we started out with a question that I thought we would just agree very quickly on and then move on to different topics, which is business and human rights racist or anti-racist? But actually, we ended up with 3 very different answers to that question. The 2 of you were closer in alignment, and I was off in my left field. And so I'm going to ask each of you to summarize your own position on that question, and then tell us whether or not you have changed your opinion, and then I'll go at the end. So Eric, can we start with you, and then Jenna, and then I'll go.
Sure. In my response to that question, I stated that business and human rights was not racist, which, if you take seriously anti-racism, it doesn't give you that space to say something is not racist, either anti-racist or it's racist. And I felt it was too strong a point to denote that business and human rights was racist, though upon further reflection, some of that is strategic. In working in predominantly white environments, if you label something immediately racist, it usually stops a conversation rather than starting one. But if we look at what is disparity, what is disproportionate, where communities bearing significant burdens based significantly on race, it's difficult to not conclude that racism is occurring. But there are ways that we talk about race where racism happens without racists. And that can be through structures and institutions and processes and procedures. But in order to dismantle that, you have to interrogate that and be affirmatively an anti-racist. Seeing were many or any businesses, I couldn't come up with an example of an anti-racist business. Certainly not prior to the assassination of George Floyd. You didn't have businesses interrogating their practices with reference to race. You don't have the UN guiding principles even mentioning the word race. So it had not been uppermost in mind. What happens instead is a sanitization of anything race translated through the lens of diversity, which has its own difficulties. There's a lot of defensive diversity happening in business as not to be labeled racist. So I did really respect Tara's position, which she will tell you about later, that maybe we do make the hard call something what it is, educate people through doing it in that way. But I will say business and human rights continues to be not racist.
Jenna, how about you?
So I said in the article that business and human rights was a tool, like any other tool. It can be wielded, so right, you can use your powers for good or for evil, and that I generally tend to think of the framework as a neutral framework, and how you use that framework can either promote a racist agenda or can promote an anti-racist agenda or something, or not racist agenda, as Erica would say. And it's funny, actually, and Tara and I have had sort of separate conversations about this. I might actually be going more towards Tara. And I have to give credit actually to a friend of mine at the University of West Indies, who is an anthropologist there, who sort of really interrogated this idea of what it means to sort of be practical, right? Because I tend to start from this vantage point of, look, from a practical standpoint, this is where we're at. And she's like, do you know how many times practicality has been used to sort of reinforce all of the existing structures which denigrate people of color? I was like, no. And she was like, yes. And I was like, but I don't mean it that way. And she was like, it really doesn't matter. So she has really challenged me on this idea of, when I say practical, or when people say practical, they are really, in fact, trying to enforce this idea of maintaining the status quo, maybe tweaking a little bit around the edges, as opposed to really engaging with the hard work of, quite frankly, burning it to the ground and starting over with the system.
Wait, can we just do this?
Yeah. Of course.
So Jenna, I think you've likely heard many times over, John Ruggie would always label himself as a principled pragmatist.
Yep.
And you are now suggesting that this is a tool, it's a neutral tool to be used for good or for, well, not ill, but for better or worse or less worse. Where does that put you?
Put me, myself
writing?
particularly, or my
understanding its genesis coming from a place of practicality,
Yeah.
right? Not burning anything down, but rather including the business community, which necessarily meant we talk in a different way.
Right. So here's where I think I come down to, and I think I'm okay with this. And it comes from two different things. One is an analogy I'll give, actually based on the conversation I had with Karen Bravo, who is a professor, now dean at the University of Indiana, Indianapolis. I'm sure I got that wrong, but she knows. Hi, Karen. So the first thing is, I don't know what the alternative is for burning it to what happens after you burn it to the ground, right? So if the idea of radicalism, which to me is sort of the opposite of pragmatism, happens, and we burn down all of like Tara might allude to later in terms of the capitalistic structures, if we burn it to the ground because it's inherently racist, what happens next? All you have is a burnt field and like lots of people milling around going, okay, what do we do now? And again, my friend Moji at the University of West Indies would challenge that and say, okay, we don't do either or, you do both. But to me, it's hard for me to reconcile that. The second thing, and it comes from the story of, and again, apparently it's an old story, so forgive me if I butcher it, but like it's a story of this group, and it's a made up story, obviously, lives in a village, and every day, and starting on some day, a body shows up, and it's like on the brink of death, and you take it into your village and you nurture it and you bring it back to health, and they don't have any memory of what happened. And then the next day another body comes, and then the next day another body comes, and then the next day another body comes. And Karen asked me once, she was like, would you be the person who is tending to the bodies, or would you be the person that goes upstream to figure out what happened? And I am absolutely that person who would go tend to the bodies, because that's in front of me. That's what I see. That's the hurt that I'm experiencing. And so I empathize with. So I want to tend to the bodies in front of me. And I think that's where my idea of using business and human rights as a tool, because I want to use anything that I can to heal the wounds that I see right in front of me, as opposed to and I recognize that this needs to happen, but I don't have the emotional capacity to then think the big abstract thoughts that requires us to go upstream or burn it to the, right? Like I can't do that. Like I know that my place in this world and my place to address this framework is to figure out that. And so, like I said, I will use every tool that I have at my disposal to address the issue right in front of me, even if it means leaving the larger structural disparities intact.
So I find that interesting, because I'm going to pick up with your analogy here. And I'm somebody who, like, the first couple of bodies that show up, I'm definitely tending to them. But by body 4, I'm not guaranteeing that I'll go up, because there's a bravery factor there too, right? Of like, how likely am I going to be killed? But I'm definitely going to convince someone to go upstream for me. Yeah. Right. I mean, I might have to at some point go upstream with them, or I take a group of people upstream with me. But someone's going upstream really fast to figure out what's going on there. And so with that, it's perhaps not surprising that when we asked this question, my answer was burn it to the ground. Sorry, that's the end of the answer. The start of the answer is, I think business and human rights is inherently racist because it's built on a capitalist assumption of how society should work. And capitalism by its nature requires exploitation and differentiation on often arbitrary grounds. And that differentiation gave rise to slavery. That need for differentiation gave rise to the historic transatlantic trade of enslaved Africans. It has given rise to and continues to justify ongoing racialized disparities in the US, the UK, Canada, France, Germany, globally. And I think that if you embrace that structure as the foundation for your answer to the structure, you end up in a constant loop that actually does just embed those hierarchies and accept those hierarchies rather than challenge them. So that was my answer in the article. It's still my answer, I think. As my students know, and as I've told them, I often disagree with myself from like 2 weeks ago, let alone 6 months ago, let alone 2 years ago, because these are issues that I'm constantly struggling to try to figure out what's the best answer to them. And I did find that both what Erica and Jenna said in the article has challenged my thinking around this. And I wonder, I use the tool of business and human rights, right? Like I use it as much as I think we can use the tool of business and human rights while keeping it, while giving it some integrity internally, right? So while recognizing that there are limits to the guiding principles, that there's a purpose to them, that there's meaning to that content, I like to use them to name and shame businesses, to convince businesses to do better, to convince states that they haven't met their obligations yet, to empower civil society to challenge both businesses and states. So I like to think that I use that tool effectively sometimes. Let's be honest, it's not always effectively, but sometimes I use it effectively.
I asked both of you or either of you to disaggregate the tools. Like, what is business and human rights? What are the tools? I know that sounds basic because we've been doing this a while, but can we identify maybe some tools that are better than other in the toolbox?
So I would say, Jenna, tell me if you like, interrupt me at any point, obviously. But I would say that the primary tool obviously is the guiding principles on business and human rights, because they've been unanimously supported by the Human Rights Council. They've been referenced in states' national action plans and in businesses' corporate purposes or corporate statements of human rights. So I think the guiding principles set out and become the tool, right? Because that's our touchstone and our reference point. And then they expect businesses to undertake human rights due diligence. And I think that then becomes its own tool with its own set of grounding legally, socially, contextually. And it can be stronger or weaker depending on where you are or what you're using it for and based off of the company. And then I think
wielding the tool.
Sorry?
Or potentially who's wielding that tool.
Yes, exactly. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and I would say that to me, it's every tool in the toolbox, right? So I think for sure the UNGPs, the UN guiding principles are the biggest tool available, but I'm hopeful that there are other tools that will become more available in every way. So for instance, one of the things that I'm actually writing about with another co-author, Rachel's an Essex grad, isn't she?
She is. Rachel
Chambers, sorry, so an Essex grad. Is on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and developing a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act for human rights. And just for those of you who don't know, it's a tool used by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the actual law, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, to sue corporations, and actually sometimes justice uses as well, to sue corporations when there has been evidence of corruption that they've engaged in and bribery that they've engaged in overseas. And there's a civil society organization called the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, ICAR, which is in trying to draft legislation that patterns itself off of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but makes it targeted specifically towards human rights. And it's really interesting because it's both a mandatory human rights due diligence model, which as Tara referenced is sort of the next stage in sort of growing on the UNGPs, but also sort of a find model, right? So that it's outcome derivative. So if they find any evidence of human rights abuses, regardless of whether or not companies have engaged in due diligence, you can be subject to liability, which is, I think, a really big step forward over the mandatory human rights due diligence processes, right? Because again, for those of you who don't know, under the mandatory human rights due diligence framework, as long as the company has been shown to comply, then they're kind of off the hook, right? And so like, oh, don't worry about the fact that that there actually was human rights abuses in our supply chain, but we did everything that we said that we were going to do. which I think is subpar as a tool. But again, I'll use it because I'll use any tool that I have.
I'm
So
going to interrupt you just long enough to tell my business and human rights students that we'll be covering those mandatory human rights due diligence next week. And we'll also be covering the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We started talking, by the way, about the fact that it was the corrupt practices movement in the US that gave rise in a lot of civil law countries to corporate criminal responsibility, because that was a foreign concept to civil law. And it was the US pushing for what was fundamentally an economics, a capitalist need for a free market or a fair market.
Well, it's funny. Sorry. So, and I geek out over this because I'm at the SEC, or I was at the SEC, but like, actually it's hilarious because the business lobby was really strong, or was trying to be really strong, and said their biggest argument was, we won't be able to compete anymore with all of the civil law countries and their companies because they engage in bribery all the time. And that 1977 Congress was like, you'll figure it out. And they did, right?
And they did. And yet every single time you have one of these debates over mandatory human rights due diligence law, everyone goes, but how would they possibly comply? Right. And think of the small and medium-sized enterprises. They can't possibly do human rights due diligence. Sorry, I don't know why I slipped into a Southern accent when I did that. But I have to say, like they did figure it out, right? Small and medium-sized enterprises can be subjected. I mean, not ultra small, but smaller, that are still traded on the public security, on the securities exchange in the US, can be held accountable under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And so they figured it out. They have those things. And, you know, there's a case going up in the US, in the US federal appellate body right now for, I think it's Fifth Circuit covers Louisiana, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Mm-hmm.
So I think it's at the Fifth Circuit right now, about an Alabama newspaper who's refusing to sign an anti-Israel BDS pledge because states in Alabama have state agencies in Alabama now require compliance with anti-BDS legislation. And all the businesses that do business with the Alabama state government have figured out how to comply with that law, right? Like, except for this one free speech newspaper. When regulations occur, first of all, let's start with the fact that when regulations occur, entire businesses are developed for compliance with those regulations. So when we talk about compliance with human rights due diligence laws, it's not, first of all, they're not complicated to date. We have yet to have a complicated human rights due diligence law. Second, there are industries that will support that compliance. And third, even if there aren't, businesses will figure it out because that's what they do when they have tricky regulation. So it drives me, that whole argument drives me crazy.
So let me bring this back, because the question that took us down this road was, what are the tools of business and human rights? And I'm hearing you, Jenna, saying any tool that we can find will work. Securities law will work. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act will work. Tara, you're saying that the UNGPs are a foundation of that, but we need to continue to like pick up a rock and figure out how to sharpen that stone into something that can work, right? Yeah. So then, if that is the case, are there ways that we can make the tools themselves anti-racist, or tools simply tools and they always remain neutral? And then we're back to who wields the tools and representation issues in leadership at the upper echelons of business, of government, of civil society organizations. Or
I think who wields the tools, Erica, I think that's an incredibly important point, right? So, and again, I think it brings us back to, and I can't remember if we talked about this during the I think we talked about this during the official presentation, right? But like, this brings up the issue of privilege, right? Like, if all of the people who are making the decisions and all the people who are sort of enforcing the laws and sort of bringing the conversation to dialogue are the people who have the most privilege, then this isn't going to work, right? Like, part of what I think is so important is bringing in the people who have been impacted the most and having them be a part of the dialogue and having them be a part of the framework and having them giving them the power to wield these tools right from the beginning. And again, I don't think that's something, I think the sort of the UN writ large, the working group as well, has just started to wrestle with this in the last, I want to say maybe 3 years. 4 years. And I really think that that is going to be critical, right? This idea, I think we need to upturn this idea of like, well, the experts are going to come in and tell you what to do. Like, no, that's kind of crap. Like, everyone needs to be involved, but the people who particularly needs to be involved are the people who are most impacted. So I think that you're absolutely right, Erica, in terms of talking about who wields these tools, especially in trying to combat a racist framework, is going to be key.
And interestingly, I don't necessarily fully agree with Jenna, but I do agree with the point you made. But I think it also goes further in the sense that I think that tools can be anti-racist by nature, and I think that there is a question of privileging within the guiding principles. It's not just on race, but also on gender. And here, Penelope Simmons and Melissa Handel have done some incredible work on raising that. And on the working group, Surya Deva has done some really important work in raising the fact that the guiding principles skim past women in the sense of, and also pay special attention to women and children, and then move on, right? And so when you are operating within the system that we operate in economically, there's a responsibility to make sure that your tools aren't simply another brick in a wall, but they actually do provide a hammer and nail, or not a nail, crowbars. That's the thing that takes yeah, I'm trying to think of an appropriate,
or a bulldozer, that's fine too.
I really need to point out that I rent my property specifically so I don't have to do any homework. So yeah, so there are tools that are better for constructing properties, and there are tools that are better for deconstructing properties.
Yeah.
And the guiding principles, unfortunately, in my opinion, are a tool that kind of, I'm not even sure.
Tinker tools, like either screwdrivers or whatever.
They do the cosmetic paintbrush, exactly.
Right.
I think that they should have moved towards being a bulldozer or something, right? Like, pretend that I know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about.
Well, I get it. It's working for me. Okay.
Yeah, I think there was a real missed opportunity there. And while I can appreciate John Ruggie and rest in peace, John, I can appreciate his choice of a principled pragmatism. I think after the kerfuffle around the draft norms, and here I want to also acknowledge David Weisbrot, who recently passed. Under the kerfuffle of the norms, I think that there was a level to which sort of a calming practical principled pragmatism approach was appropriate. But it also led to a really deeply missed opportunity to reflect on where we've come and to reflect on what structures we were allowing to embed in the tools that we're supposed to be.
Well, so Tara, can I push back a little bit? Because I think you're absolutely right. Like, I think the draft norms were the vision of what we wanted in that moment at that time, of what we wanted a business and human rights framework to be. That's why they didn't pass, right? Like, that's why sort of the UN, at that time, Human Rights Commission just shut it down, was like, thank you very much for your work. And so now we have this document that is incredibly ambitious, that challenges us, that has absolutely no weight and buy-in, right? And so I think you're right. It is not the guiding principles are absolutely not the best we can do. But again, this comes back to my idea of like, do you want it perfect or do you want it done, right? The what is it? Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good, or the good the enemy of the perfect. And in fact, and I might be changing a little bit, but I actually think one of the geniuses of Ruggie is that he kind of set things up so that this could then turn into customary international law over time, right? This idea of like a hardening of some of these soft law principles if you have enough buy-in on the state level, if you have enough buy-in, potentially on the non-state actor level. And I see from your look that you're going to push back, and that's perfectly fine. But I think at least at the time that the guiding principles were endorsed, that was my hope, I should say. Like I was hoping that the universality of how many people endorsed them gave me hope that this was going to harden into customary international law.
Yeah, I'll just weigh in here and say, I don't think it's fair to say it's a missed opportunity. He seized the opportunity that was available at the time. And I say this not based on conversations with him, but former colleagues at Human Rights Watch. They were pushing forward things like the voluntary principles. They were doing things ad hoc and reactive and responsive to the worst atrocities. What Ruggie does in some part of his work is frankly amplify the work of those human rights organizations. He didn't put anything new forward that anyone in the human rights community didn't know, but he was able to take it to people and places that didn't fully understand and appreciate it or were actively resistant to it, and David Weisbrod's work. So I think there was a smoothing over, a calming, but he wrote something that's very open textured. It's almost like the US Constitution. That's why who uses the tools, who's doing the interpretation, who is mobilizing around, at the very minimum, an admission that there is a business responsibility to not violate human rights. That was not consensus at the time it was appointed. So this is why I'm still thinking about who is wielding this tool and how much influence they have. I'll connect it back to Tara, because you've thought in terms of structures. I do think you are an upstream thinker. I've been told by people who watch the space of corporate boards that sometimes even if you diversify a corporate board, you don't get different outcomes, either because a few diverse people who are added to a board get marginalized or silenced, or simply don't wield enough power because their term of service hasn't been significant enough. So if we are going to operate within this structure and do a bit more than paint brushes, I guess this is a question of where are there opportunities to introduce anti-racism into business and human rights, which I guess is what the panel is supposed to be about. But if we take where we've been, we know we need to go someplace else. It wasn't uppermost in the minds of the framers of, I think, either document, though I do think David did reference the CERD, because he referenced all the things, like even in like Nestle case. Yeah, that's what we would have wanted then, but there are other things that we also want. We've got a climate crisis that's going to disproportionately impact people on the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, right? And elsewhere. So are there ways that we can pragmatically and practically get people thinking about being anti-racist or not racist?
So I think some of this comes down, now that I've said that, now that I've been critical of John's work with the guiding principles, not because let me say that there's a continuum of space that you had following the draft norms that would have all sort of been acceptable. And my thing is, I think John went towards a conservative understanding of that continuum. So that's where my critique is. And I think if he had gone a couple steps along the continuum, we wouldn't have the draft norms. I think the draft norms overstep a little bit. So they're not actually my ideal for what a business and human rights framework would be, but I think you could have gotten something that's a little bit more in line with the law and with where legal consensus even was at that point on things like extraterritorial human rights obligations and stuff like that. But I will say that one thing that I really liked about what he did with the guiding principles was in the state duty to protect pillar. He didn't invent any law there, but he did remind states that they have an obligation to protect human rights and to take on board their human rights responsibilities. And within that, that meant systemic integration across all of their policies and across their agencies. And when we're talking about things like environmental justice and the climate crisis, it is really significant that the negotiations for COP26 in Glasgow were happening, I think, exactly simultaneously with the negotiation of the UN binding instrument on business and human rights in Geneva. The same people were not negotiating those two treaties. So there was an opportunity there where we're really progressing a common framework, both for business and human rights and the environment, and then also ensuring that it's anti-racist. That was, again, missed, and sometimes intentionally so. There are at least 5 current EU member states who are on the Human Rights Council or will be on the Human Rights Council in January I'm going to name and shame them a little bit here. Germany, France, Netherlands, Denmark, and Luxembourg. I'm calling you all collectively out here that they at COP26 didn't insist, at least publicly, on ensuring that the environmental outcomes were human rights compliant. And if you're not embedding that human rights framework into the environmental outcomes, you're certainly not embedding an anti-racist framework into the environmental outcomes.
Right.
And so we have this really beautiful statement of what states should be doing, and they still refuse to do it because doing so is inconvenient. And doing so requires upending a lot of the embedded hierarchies within our societies.
Let's make our next piece about the internal inconsistencies between state policies in one place and another.
I would love that. I was told by people associated with some of those states that that was a matter of the EU negotiates at COP26 on behalf of the EU member states, whereas the individual members serve in their personal capacity at the Human Rights Council. That's not a good enough explanation.
Yeah.
That's not a good enough explanation. And if that's how the EU is going to function, we need to think about how we treat the EU in these international spaces, because it's not appropriate for 5 member states to water down their commitment to human rights when they are serving on the UN Human Rights Council.
Yeah.
That was my quick rant. Sorry, that's been building up in me for Joe Hoekstra, who's on
Every
here.
single one of those nations you've mentioned do have issues with racism and racism and minority communities and migrants and colonial legacies.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the other unfortunate thing is that, you know, when we look at who sits on the Human Rights Council, when we look at who we consider to be our human rights champions, the angels of our world, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, Switzerland, France, Germany, they all have significant, not just historical, but ongoing issues around racism. So I don't know that we have, and we've talked about this in the article, I don't know that we have the leadership within the business and human rights community from the state perspective to really turn business and human rights into an anti-racist tool.
Okay, so can I ask, and again, this is me and my practical, so what do we do? Like, how do we combat this issue of racism within the business and human rights framework? Because again, I understand that it's a tool and that, I mean, even I think we all agree that there are elements of racism within the business and human rights framework. So then the question is, what do we do? How do we do this, right? And I think I alluded to before this idea of like emotional capacity that I have to engage and what I can engage in and when I can't. And I think that's a very real sort of counterbalance to this idea of we want the people who are impacted to be in the room. We want the people who are affected by racism or by any sort of discrimination to be in the room, but understanding that that's also tiresome and wearisome, and like how do we fix this while again getting them to participate?
I think it comes down to leadership and commitment. Not everybody can be going all at the same time. Maybe it's a relay race and you pass the baton back and forth. But anti-racism activities are about consistency, right? Being consistent, interrogating what an institution is like, looking towards systemic and structural change, and within organizations, having people who are positioned well to do that work. Like if you're the head of HR, you're probably better positioned to do something about discrimination in your workplace than if you are just one of the single engineers in a field of thousands of them, right? So having accountability to contest racism, accountability is significant. We've not yet talked about our third pillar, but making sure that there's protections for people who bring issues up in workplaces and in the UN. And this has been a problem, like thinking about sexual harassment within UN structures and whistleblowing over that. So it's safe for people to say what is happening and making sure we have leadership in place that is willing and able to make those changes. And that will mean corrective action. That will mean removing people who can't function without relying on racism. So,
It's
Yeah.
funny actually, and I want to give Tara credit to this. Erica, what you were saying in terms of like, we want to be consistent, but we can't all do it at once. Tara and I were on a call a few weeks ago, and she, by a different analogy, almost made the exact same point of like, it was a choir, right, Tara, that you said, and everyone was singing, like this idea of when you hear a choir, they're all singing with one voice, but what you don't realize is that at different points, everyone is taking a breath, right? So that they can then rejuvenate for the next note in essence. And I thought that was I think both of your analogies are really spot on. I had forgotten actually about that because I feel like sometimes as a person of color doing this work, that I have to be singing all the time, right? Like that I have to be the one of the people doing this work all the time, or it's all going to collapse, which is incredibly vain and egotistical of my part. But it sometimes, because it feels so personal and it feels so all consuming sometimes, that it's just like, well, how does it happen? If we don't do it, how does it happen? How does it move forward? So you're right. I think that's a huge part of it.
No, I love the analogy of taking a breath, because that is breathing.
Yeah.
Sustains life, and we need to pause. We need to have a space between our inhale and our exhale, and have some self-restoration. We are in the middle of what I think beyond the US is called the Great Resignation. There's a lot of frankly stress and suffering in the way that we work and our labor, and maybe there can be a rethink as we emerge from this pandemic, because I think enough people are also exhausted of all the things, and that's simply not sustainable. So this is a micro level of how to do social change, but you can't do it without if you're dead, or if you're sick, or if you're tired, or so taking that time to take a breath, and maybe in the space of taking a breath, we can think more clearly, more creatively, and figure out what's going on upstream. But yeah.
I'm gonna so first I want to credit Connie Schultz, the American author, for the choir analogy. But I'm gonna one up Jenna's vanity here, responsibility, because I think we talk in the article about the emotional toll that this work takes on particularly the two of you, but people of color more generally speaking within this work, because it helps frame how realistic different approaches are for you. It helps you, it limits, it's just emotionally draining. It's not a necessarily a limitation thing, but it is emotionally draining to do this work all the time. And obviously, Jenna, there's a footnote in the article that references the fact that I was subjected to death threats around my anti-racism work last year. And I have to say that when they came out, the advice I was given from multiple people was, well, just lay low for a little bit, like stop speaking out on these issues, stop being on Twitter, stop talking about this, and just, you have the space. And this happened more than once, and on more than one person, more than one races of people coming to me and saying, like, just lay low, like you don't have to do this, and you don't have to do it in the various places that you're doing it in, right? So like you're doing it in the department and at the university level and in the public. So just, just lay low, no one needs you here. And I kind of felt like screaming at that point, right? Because I was just like, I know that I myself am not holding up the entirety of the anti-racism movement, right? Like I have an ego, but it doesn't quite go that far. But at the same time, I feel like there is a particular responsibility on white people to speak out on these issues, right? And whiteness is a continuum. So let's talk about the fact that like it is contextual. It is there are limits to whiteness, and there are places where whiteness is not necessarily the same. But I enjoy what's essentially universal privilege. Like there's no place in the world where I go where people are like, oh, maybe she's not white. And in addition to that, I am an able-bodied heterosexual cisgender woman, and I have multiple educational degrees. So even though I'm a migrant in this country, I'm the migrant that they love the most. And earlier today, I was having a conversation about immigration policies within this country, and they were like, don't worry. And somebody who knows immigration law really well was like, don't worry, they're never going to check on you. Like, they're never going to check whether or not you're doing what you need to do. I enjoy quite universal privilege for my whiteness, but that means that I have, if with great power comes great responsibility, there's a disproportionate responsibility on people who look like me to speak out on these issues and to take that pressure off of you and to sort of say, I'm standing in the gap so you don't have to stand here, and you can sit down when you need to, and you can take the breath that you need to. And also, like, you can exist in a space where you are not fundamentally being asked to answer for and defend the entirety of your race at all times, right? So that we can create a space that is a place for you to breathe. And so, yeah, I don't really have anything. I guess no, I do have a point to that, which is to ask both of you a couple of things. I mean, we started by you guys praising me, so I don't want to go back to like, am I doing it right? But I do want to start to say, like, what do you think? And I don't want you to have to be the ones to tell all white people how to do this work either. But
you're not all white people. Remember, we're getting away from monoliths. But yeah.
Like, what do you wish that we were like? What do you wish white people generally, and we can pick on me specifically because we have that level of trust. What do you wish that I were doing better in this space?
Well, I think white people would talk to other white people, frankly, and not come to me and say how sorry you are that this racist thing occurred. We're around the Thanksgiving holidays this year. These are tough conversations to have. I know I've got friends going back to like extraordinarily racist families, but they will keep the peace. They will stay silent. In most instances, they won't question, they won't challenge. And I understand that that's about preserving relationships, but some of that is taking the risk to reach out to the spheres of influence that you do have and believing you have that influence. That would be one. I'd rather see fewer people coming to Black churches, apologizing to Black people or stop Agent Hate. And if you are in the orbit of somebody who is a hater, let them know that that's not acceptable. Tara, when you say that people were telling you to just lay low, stay quiet, I understand. I hope you would appreciate that that was out of concern for your personal well-being, not in any move to silence you. But there are also different registers in which we can do work. Sometimes we're shouting, sometimes we're whispering, sometimes we're doing it inside our workplace, sometimes we're doing it inside our families. And figuring out where you are most effective, most emotionally comfortable, but a lot of this will be emotionally uncomfortable. And a lot of it will be unsafe. I'm reminded, there was Sandy Hook, not Sandy Hook, the slaughter, there's a documentary film out now. It's the high school students who
Stonewall,
Marjorie Stonewall. So there became a few student speakers. One was a white guy, one was a Latinx woman. The two of them were on a panel, and he got so much more hate than she did. And I think it was almost that people felt white enough, like he was starting to talk about things that you just don't expect young white men to be talking about. So I'm kind of starting to appreciate risk for white people who don't toe the line or even acknowledge that, hey, there's a line there, and people don't like it. So I wonder if in some ways, without being prepared to do the work, that we prepare ourselves along the way, but knowing that allies are needed in majority populations as well as minority populations, and some of the pushback you're going to be getting. I mean, people kind of expect, I think, in a subconscious way, Jenna or I to talk about racism. Yeah. In fact, they come, well, except for this publication, which was weird. Often I am sought out for doing this kind of work. I think there are other colleagues who can do this in a different way, in a different register, and that's equally valuable. But we can't minimize the really vicious pushback people get for stepping out of what the line is perceived to be in their majority community.
Can I add a nuance to what Erica said in terms of, and again, I don't want to speak to you for your experience, but I think that people sort of seek us out, people of color, to talk about our personal experience. And then they'll seek out you, Tara, to talk about the expert experience on this, right? And I think that sort of genesis for this article is like a perfect example of that, right? This idea of like, if someone wants to talk about racism and like how the Black experience is, Erica and I will be on the first, on the thing, right? Like, because we feel it. If someone wants to talk about it from a like, and this is what the experts say, it is just as likely that you will, or probably sometimes more likely that you will get a call as opposed to Erica and I. And so I think that's an important thing in terms of recognizing things that white people can do, is recognizing the value of people of color, period, writ large, and like diversify, like bringing in a diversity of discussions from all standpoints, right? So like, yes, I'm a Black woman and that gives me a specific sort of vantage point, but I'm also a Black woman who teaches business and human rights, who worked at the Securities and Exchange Commission, who has an expertise from that experience, right? And so I think that is an important thing to sort of talk about. And I think it's something white people can do. And I know we have to go to the Q&A. So I guess the final thing I'll say is like, I want to get to a point where we don't have to differentiate, right? Where everyone is just doing this work all the time. And so it's kind of like we've rendered ourselves obsolete, right? And so I whatever we can do and whatever space we have to allow it to sort of think through these things, including having the hard conversations. And I mean, Tara and Erica know this, I come from a biracial family, and most of my family is white, in terms of who I go over to for Thanksgiving dinners. And so we have had those really hard, really difficult conversations. I can think of them very specifically, really have conversations. And so I think that is everyone's role. But I think the difference is that, again, my biracialness allows me to have intimate relationships with some white people in a way that I wouldn't normally. As people who are privileged, you have access to like folks who might not think about this way, might not think about a progressive anti-racist agenda in a way that I do not often have, right? Like most racist white people aren't coming up to me and talking and saying, so educate me on an anti-racist agenda. Like it's just not happening. Yeah.
I do want to acknowledge more generally, we've talked about this in our before ever writing this article conversations, that the two of you work geographically in two of the whitest places that you can work in the United States, right? For those of you who aren't familiar with US internal politics or dynamics, Utah and West Virginia are not particularly well known for their diversity, either of thought or race, or even in many ways of economic status, although Utah is a little bit better on that than West Virginia is. And so I think first of all, I think you guys probably have those conversations much more frequently than you actually would if you were in places like Cleveland, where the community is larger and more diverse, but therefore also in some ways differentially segregated. I don't know if that's true or not, but so I'm going to ask the two of you if you think that's true, I guess.
I actually don't think that's true. I think that my impact as someone who lives in West Virginia is a little different in that, again, the folks who tend to have racist views aren't coming up to me and engaging in conversation about these issues. But I think just by dint of where I live and the demographics of where I live and the geographic sort of dimension, I'm going to interact with them on some level. And so I tend to approach all relationships from I'm going to kill them with kindness, right? Like and so I tend to interact with someone from like the hollows of West Virginia in the same way as someone from like, the cranky guy from New York City. Like I tend to approach that in the same way. And my hope is that by doing so, I sort of subtly deconstruct maybe some of their preconceived notions. And I just do it. I mean, again, I don't know how much of this is ingrained, how much of this is sort of like I've just taken it on, but I just sort of do it, right? Like I don't sort of consciously think I'm going to do my role to combat racism today by like being nice to every white person I come across. but like it sometimes it is the best I can do in that moment without exhausting myself by trying to engage. So
Yeah, Utah is very different than West Virginia. I mean, our history is different.
Yeah.
It's kind of a Western settler colonial pioneer experience, but also a community that is homogeneous or for a long time had been around a particular religious faith. So it doesn't have the same history as the South, the Deep South. But there are difficulties in dealing with difference. So almost when I got here, it's almost like being a novelty because there's so few people of color. So it, yeah, conversations are sought out and they happen in different ways. Yeah, this is.
I can let you off the hook here.
Yeah, no, it's you know, nobody's going to be burning a cross on their lawn, or at least I wouldn't have thought so until like the last administration. But they're just subtle ways of exclusion and that occur, right? But people tend to be, or it's been my personal experience, people have been more curious than committed to hate. There's a lot of ignorance and misunderstanding, but there are also people who are interested in understanding or purport to be. But then I don't really see significant change. So remains to be seen. But I do believe that people who don't have hard commitments to hate can be educated. And even some people who had hard commitments to hate potentially could learn or be educable or change. But when you are in such an overwhelmingly homogeneous area, there are both fewer opportunities for it and more opportunities for it. I am absolutely convinced that if I lived in a Cleveland or, well, certainly in Chicago, or a place that was more balanced with demographic representation, I'd probably not be doing this work at all. And I wouldn't have the conversations or as much of it. So there's more to be done because minority status is all the more pronounced when you're in a state that has like less than 1% African-American people.
Yeah.
So.
And I should just, as a final note, I really want to say, I love my state. I need to be very clear about, like, I don't, as Tara and Erica, I never want to leave my state. And part of that is because of the welcome, the sense of community that I have encountered here, right? That has seemed to have gone, I mean, again, people say ignorant crap all the time, but like this, the way that people have interacted with me at all times, and their willingness to do so has created a community that I never want to leave. So I'm actually tearing the roof off of my house to make that, to make it bigger so that I could never ever leave.
I mean, it is one of there are many things about Jenna that I find absolutely fascinating, but that choice to stay in West Virginia is amongst the top 20. I'm not going to say it's the most fascinating, but it is amongst the top 20. I do want to open it up for question and answers. If you're here and you want to do that, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer questions. You can also, if you want to, I guess, put a note in the chat, and I do have the ability to allow you to talk. So if you want to ask questions that way, just say that you have a question in the chat function so I can see it. I'm gonna pick up while we wait for questions on something Jenna said about the need to get to a place where we don't differentiate between white and Black, or white and brown people of color more broadly when it comes to who's doing this work on anti-racism. Because I was gonna say, I am not advocating for a colorblind society. Let me make that very clear. I didn't think that you were, but rather that like everyone's doing this work all the time in a variety of different ways. That sort of call to action. And I think there's a couple of things that I wanted to say on that, because it ties us back to the beginning of our conversation where I said, like, if you're white and you're being asked to write the first article on racism and business and human rights, if you're not checking your privilege, then you're not ready to write that. And I think that there's kind of this this thing that happens in the sort of life cycle of a white anti-racist, if I can call it that, which is at some point you think that you're ready to go out and take over the entire work, and you're ready to lead. And in those moments, I think, is when you really need to seek out other white people within the community to check whether or not you're actually ready to lead on these discussions, because and also have friends, as I do with Erica and Jenna, who I think if I were stepping out too far or stepping out in the wrong direction, would rightfully have the side conversation with me to be like, that wasn't helpful, that wasn't good.
Well, and Tara, to your credit, you solicit that. Like I remember, and I mean, I don't actually remember the details, but like Tara has come to me at different points and saying, this is how I'm reacting in this space, but I want to make sure that I'm reacting in this space as is not a result of my privilege. And in fact, should I be reacting this way, right? And I really appreciate it. And I really appreciated that I was honest with her and I was like, well, maybe this would have been a different choice, right? And like, she really did just sort of take it in and was like, okay, thank you. That's really helpful. And I give you a ton of credit for that, hon.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But I mean, I'm better at what I do, first of all, I've long been better and in multiple different ways at what I do for having you both in my life. This is one aspect of the manifestation of that friendship and collegial relationship. The other thing I want to say about business and human rights for our colleagues who are hopefully watching this after the thing is, I feel like in this space, if you're like, there's always this question of how diverse is your syllabus? How do we include voices of color? And I think it was you, Erica, who said something about, no, sorry, it was Jenna who said something about like valuing people. I don't remember which one of you said it.
Their personal expertise rather than their expertise, personal experience versus expertise.
Exactly, that dynamic. And in this field, if you are looking at who's writing interesting things, right? If you're looking at who's writing both foundational texts that you should be reading about business and human rights, but then also the advanced, interesting stuff that's dissecting human rights, that's looking at accountability, that's looking at new and creative things, your syllabus should be naturally diverse. And Joe and I were talking, again, Dr. Joe Hoekstra, who's here. And Joe, if you ever want to intervene and tell me that I'm wrong about anything, you even know how to use the chat to tell me that. But we were talking the other day that like, I often just construct my syllabus based off of like, what do I think is really cool that's being said that I haven't seen before? And then the final part of that construction is going back and doing the check, right? Like, am I getting the balance right in terms of voices? Have I made sure that like, there are enough different perspectives? And I don't just mean different in terms of the colors of the people who are writing them, but also the cultures that are being represented, the intellectual differences that exist within our community. What does diversity look like within my syllabus? And every time that I do it that way, my syllabus is inherently diverse because our community of scholars is inherently diverse. And so I would just make a plea to my colleagues. I think when, and Jenna, you and I talked about this, and we did another one of these talks with Penelope Simmons in Canada a couple of weeks ago. I have no sense of time. So like it was sometime between last April and now. We did a talk and I said, you know, when people want to organize conferences in this space, what they tend to do is go, who are the big names that we can invite, rather than who are the people writing interesting things, right? And if you go with who are the big names, we can rattle them off. It's not a particularly diverse group. Why? Because the social structures by which we appreciate someone's value or input, the nature that by which we're taught to assess people's height or significance in a field are ones that include gender and race as part of the construct. So you end up, and these, by the way, I'm about to name a bunch of people I have tremendous amounts of respect for, deeply love and admire, and have like would absolutely invite any of them to any conference that I would organize. But you're going to go Doug Cassell and Sheldon Leader, and I mean, before John and David's passing, the two of them, Larry Kattebecker. I've now just blanked on everyone else in our field.
Robert McCorkle.
Yeah, Robert McCordale, Florian Wetstein, Michael Santoro, right? Like your list becomes, and then obviously Surya Deva, Anita Ramasastry, and Michael Addo.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's not actually the makeup and diversity within our field. That's not representative of the field as a whole. And it's not representative, even while each of them individually write really interesting and important things, it's not representative of the interesting work that's going on in our field. And if you inverse that discussion and you start from the where am I hearing stuff that I haven't heard before? Where am I hearing something that just is challenging my thinking? Your syllabus and your conferences get really diverse really fast.
Well,
I
and
love that, Tara. Where am I hearing something that is challenging my thinking?
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of what's happening in the US Legal Academy is perhaps running counter to that.
Yeah.
At least in the institution that I'm in, where there's an emphasis on placement and publication, and placement replicates in the mainstream law reviews the things that are already in the mainstream law reviews. So people who are publishing in interesting places like specialty international journals or environmental journals, I am worrying that the structure of our profession that's being driven by some of the people in leadership in the legal academy profession, I'm talking about the US, who are rankings that were not incidentally created by, I think, 2 white guys like Brian Leader, like the rankings of different law reviews and that sort of thing, may well serve to continue to replicate the same kinds of conversations, and there'll be fewer risks to challenge thinking or conventional wisdom. So as we are creating this field or part of people evolving it forward, I'd like us to be mindful of that.
Well, and I think this is really important to just highlight the distinction that we made a little bit in the article, but that's worth sort of bringing up here. The distinction between business and human rights as a framework and business and human rights as a field, right? And I think that goes back to Erica's point in terms of like who's wielding the tools, because I have said that I got into this work because I wanted to finally be on the side of angels, right? I mean, how could you be more, righteous than if you were working on human rights? And I have found in my experience that people get into this work with all different kinds of reasons and all different kinds of agendas that tend to run counterintuitively to what I would have thought. And so I think we also really need to think about what does our field look like in terms of the humans and the persons, and like, who are we bringing in? And is, for instance, the makeup of the working group naturally diverse in terms of racial and gender because we are trying to amplify voices, or just because suddenly everyone was like, oh, we need to think about gender diversity, so we'll pick that person, right? Like, I think that distinction matters. And I think how we approach the field matters, because you're going to find people who have this personal and professional expertise in every walk of life, right? In every sort of country, racial, ethnic, transgender, diverse, like you're just going to find it. It just requires you to sort of look, right? And look for this idea of like, who's doing new and interesting stuff? Who will challenge me? How do I do this? So I think it's important that we make that distinction between the framework and the field. And actually, Erica, I think the way that you just said it in this conversation is perfect. Is like, I think the tools, who wields these tools, is the linchpin for that, right? Like the distinction between the framework and the field. And sort of, and again, the cost of what that means to wield these tools, because there is a cost. There just is.
Responsibility too, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Nobody has questions for us?
Yeah, Katya, you briefly had your hand raised. So how about we go to you?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for this extremely insightful session. I think it's one of my favorite for this year. I'm very grateful to you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Tara, for inviting our guest speakers. Just one of the things I wanted to share with you, because it's something happened to me in the past. I do have a set of expertise, but over the years, when I was invited, I wasn't invited for my set of expertise. I was invited to talk because I was representative of Syrian / refugee / woman / Asian / whatever. And I've raised it many times that I'm invited for that. And in these sessions that I was invited to, I said, I actually have no expertise, but I am being called for this. And this isn't, and I came here just to highlight that. Right. And I think that's exhausting and annoying. And I know people are trying to kind of raise the numbers of participation, et cetera, but I think this is not a subtle issue. It's yeah.
You're reminding me of an experience I had around the time of George Floyd's assassination, where everyone in Utah is looking for a Black person to come talk about something to maybe make them feel better. So I'm on a board of some organization and they're like, oh, can you come talk about George Floyd? I'm like, well, no, but I could come talk about my book, which is actually related to the subject of what you're supposed to care about. Right. So I
Did they
find
invite you?
oh yeah, they did. They
Okay.
did. And did it later. So it wasn't kind of a reactive. So here's another thing for all of us. We do get to say yes and no, and we do get to own and shape to some significant extent how we are going to exist in this profession.
Yeah.
So yeah, but pointing people away from the experience to the expertise. And I think that is something that we need to do a bit more to claim as women of color often. Carmen Gonzalez, who's now edited 2 volumes of Presumed Incompetent, does a lot of thinking about the presumption that women of color law professors and others have to overcome in our profession, one that does trend towards the conservative, the conventional, the safe, what's pragmatic even. So yeah, but we can hold each other to account for that. And it's just beautiful to see this relationship where we can ask each other's questions and get some constructive feedback. So
yeah. Thank you, Kasia, for your question.
Yeah,
For your
thanks.
comment.
I'm gonna say, I think that we've all been I mean, obviously, again, I'm coming with it from points of privilege, but I have definitely been the person who's been asked at the last minute to be the women's panelist on
Oh yeah.
without realizing without realizing at first. So that's why I'm being asked, right? And for a while, I went through a point of insisting that I just wouldn't say yes to any of those invitations if I was the only woman, right? Like, because the reality is, and sociological studies show us that there are limits when there's only one woman at the table, right? And you need 2 women at the table to start to normalize and to have and for people to hear you. And I have to give credit here to some of my colleagues in the department, because without ever realizing it, we some of us adopted a bit of a Obama administration women's empowerment approach. So for those of you who aren't familiar, there's several accountings of how the women in Obama's administration, when they would be in a room, they would get talked over, or men would have the same idea that they had and suddenly get all the credit for the things that the woman had already come up with. And so the women developed a very intentional strategy of amplifying each other and kind of downplaying the contribution of the men who were replicating what women had already said and taking credit for it. So if Jenna, I'm going to randomly make you a man in this scenario.
Sure.
4 of us here we're in a room, and Eric has said something, and then Jenna said something and tried to take credit for Erica's idea. It would be my role to step in and intercede and say, well, actually, as Erica said, like, I agree, blah, 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 and really amplify and return to the point that she is the one where this originated, and we need to give credit for that. And there are several women in our faculty now who do that, but it's also our responsibility to do that in these spheres where we're given the opportunity. You know, we have dropped a lot of names of colleagues in this thing. Thankfully, so far it's all been praised, and that's largely because for me, dropping those names is a form of honoring and recognizing that leadership. So you know, Anita and Penelope and Surya get credit for the work that they have done in opening up spaces within this field.
Well, and I need to say, Michael Addo for me has been a particularly big sponsor, right? So like, and they talk about this distinction between being a mentor and a sponsor, right? The mentor is the person who guides you, and the sponsor is the person who sort of advocates for you when you're not in the room. And I think, so I give Michael Addo all the credit for that, sort of in my early days as a business and human rights scholar. But I also think that that's in terms of going back to, like, you know, what can white people do? That's another thing that white people can do, right? Is be sponsors of the people who are not in the room and say, why aren't these people in the room? Why haven't you amplified their voices? What is it about them that we are sort of dismissing? So I think that's a very concrete, real thing that we can do in all aspects of both the business and human rights framework, but also the business and human rights field.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also want to give a shout out to Michael, who, by the way, is an Essex alum as well, who he did his PhD here. And he lives just down the road from us. So at some point, Michael, I'm assuming you're watching this, and at some point in the near future, I will be begging you to come and visit us here soon. We are almost out of time, so I want to just give you guys each an opportunity to sort of provide final reflections, anything that you didn't get a chance to say that you really wish that you could have said. So we'll go in the exact opposite order of how I started this thing. So Jenna, you'll go first for 2 minutes, and then Erica, 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
I mean, you can have more or less time.
No, I was gonna say I don't have any back. So first of all, thank you guys so much for inviting us, for having us. I'm really, again, grateful for the kind of work that this has, that this produced, right? And talking to Tara and Erica and then writing this together. And I'm also really grateful for the dissemination that's gotten. It's funny, like this really has produced, I think, what we had hoped at the beginning, and that it has started several conversations. And I'm very humbled and grateful for that. I would encourage everyone who's watching to keep the conversations going. So bringing that into the work that you do as professors, as scholars, as advocates, as business communities, I think is super important, and will sort of engender the transition that we want to have in terms of the world we want to see. So thank you again, Tara, for bringing it together. I mean, both for the article and for this. I'm very grateful.
Yeah. Same. I truly appreciated, particularly at the point in time that Tara reached out to me to be a part of this, because I'd been in isolation on a long project for a long time. So I especially appreciated the process of engaging with others, exchanging ideas, and making an article that wasn't the conventional siloed academic alone in a space writing away. That was very healthy for me and very helpful. And it's been very gratifying to see this conversation being taken up in places and spaces I hadn't anticipated it having the register that it has. So thank you both. And Tara, thank you especially for being so conscientious and thoughtful and gracious and reaching out to create and co-create and collaborate.
Well, thank you to both of you for first of all saying yes to that first initial invitation, saying yes to the subsequent invitations that came, including the one for today. And then more broadly, just thank you guys for being my teachers and my mentors and my friends, not just on this issue, but within business and human rights more broadly, and within a career in academia more broadly. I do think that this article, first of all, it is to date the thing that I am most proud of participating in. And that's saying a lot, because Jenna and I also have this book where we bring community voices into the conversation. We tried to amplify community voices in our Dying to Be Heard book by letting people speak for themselves. And so I'm also, it is a 1-2 close proximity there of those two things, being the two things I'm most proud of. But it's also a matter of, that's the product of years of friendship and trust. And I don't think that we could have produced what we did, but for those years of trust and conversation, but for a couple of conversations in Geneva hotel rooms and on tram stops and stuff like that, where we started these things. I mean, I remember being with each of you at separate points in the week after Trump's election, and not the week, but the month of Trump's first election, or only election. Let me be clear, only election.
Yeah.
But, and I remember sort of that sense of untethering that we all had from our historical, social, cultural identities, right? And I think that was the start of a really fruitful set of relationships that we've been able to develop, and it's allowed for us to sort of set an agenda, I think, for the business and human rights field as a whole. An agenda we didn't get a chance to really talk about where we want the field to be going, but it's an agenda that I am looking forward to seeing expanded with people from other regions of the world and from other states who are also struggling with issues of racism. That will start, thankfully, we're seeing the start next week with this panel that Jenna's speaking on. And so I'm very excited about that. And I'm just really, truly grateful to the two of you for, first of all, being in this journey with me and the holistic journey, and then specifically for saying yes to both the article and today. So thank you both. On that note, I'm gonna Katya, I don't know what I'm supposed to do at this point. So
well, I would say final thanks to all of you. That was really amazing. I will share the link to our YouTube video with you later, and hopefully we'll get to meet in person. Thank you very much for your time and effort.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks so much.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Talk to you soon. Bye.